Alright, welcome back everyone dito sa latest episode ng The Deep Dive with the Richard Darian, the most flamboyant intellectual in the country according to our great guest today. Great guest today. Well, then maybe you'll give that to me, at least the most flamboyant intellectual in the country. Thank you, Sensei Walden Belly, for joining us. The reason I have to say Sensei is because Van Jackson, a good Bernie bro friend of ours, was saying, "Oh, it's so great you're reaching out to Walden Belly." It's like, what are you talking about? This guy has been like, he's my mentor. He's the reason why I've become, well, whatever is good with me na lang. Thanks to you. All my writing manic output is thanks to you, Walden. So thank you so much, Walden, for joining us. And thank you for tolerating Ronald Llamas in our previous episode. We were worried. I was worried about Ronald.
No, Ronald and I go back a long way, and we're what can I say? We're like
You can
uh,
say it. You can say it.
no. What I mean is that we're almost like sidekicks when it comes to humor, and unless you stop us, it will continue on and on and on. But thank God you were there so that you were able to stop the synergy of jokes coming in between us. So anyway.
I have no problem with the synergy of Joe. I have more problems with the politically incorrect jokes of Ronald Llamas and his overshare.
Oh,
He
oh, okay.
overshares. I was like, I'm not interested in your personal life. Like, no, like suddenly we're in Norway. He'll say, "Oh, in Norway, no, 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 no. I'm not interested in personal stories in Norway or whatever." Okay, we might go down the drain. Because I know in some other podcasts, the friends of ours, they keep on going back to, which what I'm talking about, right? There's certain chapter since Valentine's Day in Ronald's love life. I don't want to go down that road. Um, well, then I want to also apologize if we got a little bit too flamboyant and we may have fired in many wrong directions. Like I know
No,
you
no,
were the
that's
one moderating me and Ronald, actually.
no flamboyant. As I said, it's a positive adjective. In my memoirs, I describe my dad as flamboyant, because he was really, really a very interesting character.
So that
And
is so it's good to know that Ilocanos are flamboyant like me too, right? Kasi mga Ilocanos are usually not that flamboyant, except if
no,
they're
but that's true. No, you're right. It's
right?
usually I think the stereotype of Ilocanos are that they're quite serious and yeah, uptight and
Austere, yeah.
austere and working all the time. Certainly, you and my dad are out of that stereotype, So that was so. Anyway, I've always flamboyant is almost like colorful. That's it. That's it. A colorful personality.
Colorful. Better than complex personality kasi almost criminal na yan when we talk about it. No, but Walden, we really appreciate you hosting us on multiple occasions. The Volume 1 and Volume 2 so far are doing very well. Marami nainggit. Sabi na, ba't hindi sila sinesali? Ba't hindi sila inimbita? Sabi ko, wait lang. Logistics yung issue. But we hope to continue these conversations on many fronts. Hopefully, we can do the Volume 3 with Ronald, with other friends from across the political spectrum soon. Gramsci pa lang, we can have a 7 volume on Gramsci if people want. But today, Walden, I want to go back to something that is very urgent and something that has been central to your thesis for decades, obviously. I mean, since your discussions about Asian financial crisis, you have been foretelling the rise of China. And as Lee Kuan Yew put it, the rise of China doesn't require just another new balance of power. It requires a new global order altogether because China is just so big and transformational. So the context of our conversation today is something we were not able to do last meeting because I think the last meeting what happened with Ronald is I think we got bogged down on the whole EDCA Philippine US China triangle. Today what I want to
and
discuss
and the Catholic Church.
and many other things that I
Yeah,
rather not discuss and I think let's
yeah.
just move forward from that. But all I can say is if there are friends out there who may have been slighted. Believe me, it was very unintentional. Really, it was I and Ronald who will bear all the responsibility if we threw out some, let's just say, unfounded questions. And Walden was very gentlemanly. By the way, let me also clarify. The reason nakatayo ako kasi Walden, maraming na-comment, why are you like interrogating two elderly gentlemen? Kasi nakatayo ako, di ba? Sabi ko, logistics yan, wala akong chair. Like, what is wrong with you? It's like you're interrogating these two elder gentlemen about their past. What is this? Um, so anyway, just to be clear, that was not a kind of a mafia shakedown, right? Of like my neighbors or something like that. Going back to this, Walden, I want to ask you about China
Hmm.
because in terms of purchasing power parity, some would say China's overtaken the United States, had overtaken the United States since 2012, right? But in nominal terms, that's also closing in. But for me, more than the size of the Chinese economy and the gross domestic product, what is really amazing to me is that China, at the per capita income of barely 10, $11,000, is scaring the heck out of, forget about Americans, even Germans, when it comes to car production. This year, China had more exports of car than practically all of their top competitors combined, especially in EV cars.
Sure.
BYD is eating Tesla for lunch. I was in a Tesla BGC the other week, and they were telling me that even sila aminado, the final work mas maganda pa sa BYD among other things. I won't say sino dyan sa Tesla. So there's a lot we can discuss. Well, then, can you lay out the big framework here? Where are you coming from in terms of your understanding of the rise, or to put it more correctly, the re-emergence of China as the preeminent power, economic power in the world?
Well, first of all, let me just say it's official now that the Chinese economy is the largest economy in the world. I say it's official because on February 5th, the New York Times said that the US is only the second largest economy after China. Now, when the New York Times says that, it's official. China is now the largest economy in the world. In fact, I posted that on Facebook, and uh, there were many people who were really quite taken by it. Let me put it this way. Um, Several things. First of all, I think that China, as a developing country, was from the very start different from other third world countries because it had been able to basically have a very successful anti-imperialist revolution that took power in 1949. And what happened was, therefore, you had the creation of a state that was born out of revolution and civil war that then went from there to beating the United States or fighting the United States to a draw in the Korean War.
A
Uh,
standstill.
yeah, standstill. And so my sense, therefore, is you had the creation of a fairly strong state that was very different from other third world states that were very much weak compared to the big powers, and didn't have the strength of big powers, including what were in Asia, later known as the newly industrializing countries like South Korea and Japan, which were known for having strong states, but nevertheless they did not have the same kind of strength that the Chinese state had, because basically, like both Korea and the United States and Japan uh, were
Protectorate
were
of
the
US.
protectorates of the United States. But China was, in that sense, different. And I think what China did was to parlay that strong state into negotiations for economic negotiations with the West, particularly after the Cultural Revolution. And what you had was a state that was on unequal terms with the Western states and with the United States. So this was not a subordinate state. This was a state that was coming in equal terms in negotiating with the United States and the corporations of the United States, the transnational corporations, because what happened is after the devastation of the Cultural Revolution uh, with Deng Xiaoping, okay, coming in, the there was this very, very strong push uh, to be able to open up the economy, but in a way that the Chinese economy would be able to access particularly advanced technology from the West. So what we had, and this is uh, basically the way that I put it in the various things that I've written, is you had the Chinese Communist Party basically enter into what I call a devil's bargain with the West. And this was to offer up its labor force, cheap labor, which was 2 to 5% the cost of US labor, uh, and um, and offer that in exchange for, for the comprehensive development of the Chinese economy and the acquisition of advanced technology. So that was sort of the quid pro quo. And they were able to successfully draw in massive capital investments from both Europe, but especially from the United States.
And
And
Taiwan. And Taiwan. They got a lot of investment from
of
Taiwan.
course,
More than
yeah,
$100
yeah,
billion in the
yes,
1990s. Yeah.
sure. And from Hong Kong and from Southeast Asian overseas Chinese community. But the so you had this situation whereby the US transnational corporations just could not resist the offer of very cheap labor. So that although they did not like it, they had to acquiesce. In order to access cheap labor, they had to acquiesce to the technology transfer that the Chinese wanted. And in fact, Deng Xiaoping, from the very start, said it was not worth opening up to the West unless there was the transfer of advanced technology. And he was very, very firm on that. So from the very beginning, therefore, it was a question of we give you cheap labor, you give us advanced technology. And what I would just like to say, Richard, here is that it was very costly for the Chinese. There was, in terms of the unequal exchange,
And
uh,
the social dislocation, the loss of
right,
the
yeah,
certainties of, what
yeah,
was it, the iron rice ball or and all of that. Yeah.
right, right. It's not
Mm.
in terms of unequal exchange, the Chinese were on the negative side by an estimate of around $19 trillion. Okay,
Right.
so, in terms of the the balance sheet in terms of the exchange with U.S. capital, but they did get what they wanted. They got advanced technology and they were able to comprehensively develop the Chinese economy. They reduced poverty to 2% of the population. It's the World Bank that says that, not the Chinese government. And they
Right.
build up this tremendous, very advanced infrastructure, so that one of the most impressive things about China at this point in time is it has the most developed railroad um, system in the world.
High speed railroad. Yeah. Super high.
Two, yeah, super fast railroad that there's only one sector of the U.S. rail system, the Northeast Corridor from Boston to Washington, that can be said to be high-speed railway in the same sense that you had about 26,000 kilometers in China at this point in time. And so what we've seen is that in the space of 30 to 35 years, what you had was China coming from being completely outside the capitalist system to becoming the number one economy in the world. The fastest, um, um, the fastest journey from the periphery to the center ever experienced in history at this point in
Well,
time.
I would say the most successful capitalist expansion story, although we can have a
Sure.
debate about whether capitalism is really the right way to put it, because there's also a lot of debate about that. Walden, I want to go back a little bit. I half jokingly told you when you said let's start from 1950s. I said no. Let's start from the Warring States period, because our good friend Francis Fukuyama, I think he was able to redeem himself throughout the years by writing a couple of good books, and his two-volume books, Origins of Political Order and Political Order and Political Decay, especially the first volume one. I think it's very instructive when he very objectively looks at the foundations, the thousands years old foundation of the Chinese state system. And in fact, if anything we see about developmental state in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam nowadays, not to mention Taiwan and Singapore, these are derivatives essentially of the Chinese modern bureaucracy established 2,000 years ago, right? And Leibniz and the Europeans and Voltaire's centuries earlier look at China as the same way we look at Singapore today, right? Like we cite Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore as like the model of governance and all of that. That's how the Europeans used to talk about China. So I want to go back to this because the question for me, Walden, is where does the communism come in? I remember one of the most interesting line in Henry Kissinger's book on China, which I also saw in your library. He said something like Deng Xiaoping was a negation of negation, right? So if Mao Zedong was a negation of kind of a neo or late Confucian feudalism, Deng Xiaoping was a negation of a kind of an inefficient Soviet-style industrial expansion, which explains, of course, we overlook. I think we have to be fair. We have to mention the Great Leap Forward and the crazy cultural revolution that happened later on. So tens of millions of people died there, and that's a horrible stain on China's history. We shouldn't overlook that. But nevertheless, by the time Deng Xiaoping comes in, this is the most impressive non-Western state system that was just waiting to download a bit of the software of the West and a little bit of hardware of the West. And in many ways, wasn't it inevitable that this China, with this history, 1,000 years of meritocratic bureaucracy, thousands of years of strategic culture and statecraft, and you know, as I said, you can say anything about Mao and Deng and Xi Jinping, but I never questioned their patriotism. I believe they truly love their country. I believe that they're doing whatever they believe is truly great for China, and they're really steeped in their country. Something I cannot say about a lot of other leaders around the world, right? Um, um, I want to ask, where does the communism aspect come in? Is this more of China with communistic characteristic, or more of communism with Chinese characteristic? Because sometimes I tend to believe it's the other way around. That communism is just it was just like a partial Western bug or software they try to incorporate into something much deeper and much more historically grounded. Am I making sense, Walt? Am I over orientalizing the situation?
No, I mean, if you ask me, I think that Mao and Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping were very serious Marxists, and basically they saw that Marxist-Leninism was the answer to what was then they called a semi-colonized China that was being assaulted on all sides by the West. And
And Japan.
so they basically they were very serious, and at the same time, of course, in the guerrilla war, they were able to modify, the methods of coming to power from the sort of Bolshevik Leninist kind of thing that happened in the Soviet Union and the old Russia. And but I would not question the fact that they were very serious, that it wasn't that, and they in fact saw the old China as really the problem, and the old bureaucratic China as as standing in the way of what they considered to be, the avenue to both modernization and to a socialist society. So, but then this is really one of the 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 paradoxes of history, in the sense that agents of history oftentimes are motivated by one thing, and then they end up with another thing. Basically, Mao, as just to take as an example, Mao was, I think nobody can deny that really Mao was uh, was a revolutionary who or you might even say a permanent revolutionary with his
Was a-
cultural
in Asia,
revolution.
he was a Trotsky of Asia.
Oh, whatever we call that. But in any event, I think that Mao did create a very strong Chinese state that had both, you know, the antecedents in the old China, but at the same time, it was sort of a very strong modernizing state. So, and that provided, and this is why I disagree with the people that would put a break between Deng Xiaoping and Mao, like Acemoglu and Robinson. I mean, it's almost like they are saying, don't, Mao is, put him out of the equation. You can only start from Deng Xiaoping. But Mao provided the sort of strong state framework within which Deng Xiaoping's push for capitalist modernization took place. Without having that state that was won over from imperialism in the 40s and late 40s, we would not have had the kind of flourishing of state capitalism in China that Deng Xiaoping started. So basically, all I'm trying to say here is that people may start from different motivations, and then because of the way history works, they end up creating something else, which is a strong capitalist state that is now the number one economy in the world, according to the New York Times, as we said. Uh, so I think it's the paradoxes of history that basically it was a communist party that is now leading the world's number one capitalist power. So I would say that we need to factor the interaction between subjective desires and objective realities, and how they can create something very
Unintended,
different from
unintended
what was
consequence.
originally intended.
Well, I want to go back to this. I think that's why I think I like how Kissinger approached it, in the sense that he saw a dialectical nexus from Mao cleansing or purging China of its feudalistic relics, and then setting it up for this kind of a supercharged, ready to launch super
Mhm.
capitalist system that we're seeing. So I think, interestingly, Kissinger got it more correctly than the Achemoglus. We'll go back to the Achemoglus later on when I want to discuss industrial policy, because you have a couple of very high level analysis from people like Yuan from SAIS, among others, who have been arguing that actually China is a great example that you don't need so-called inclusive institutions to create very advanced systems, right? Because on the surface, China is not an inclusive system. It's a very state driven, it's a very totalitarian system. And yet, technologically, my goodness, it's just producing things that even at the height of Sputnik and Soviet Union, no one thought
Well,
could produce outside the East,
well,
outside the West. Sorry.
this is why I find it very strange. Well, maybe it's not so strange that they gave the Nobel Prize to Acemoglu and Robinson and Johnson, who are basically talking about how they explain the fact that the most successful industrializers in history, in recent history, have been basically non-inclusive states. And of course, China is the principal example if we use their definition of inclusive, politically inclusive, and that sort of thing. Because in terms of economic inclusiveness, who can deny the fact that reducing poverty to 2% of the population, I mean, that is economic social inclusiveness, right? I mean, there's a problem on the political side, but basically that's why I don't think that Asimoglu and Robinson and many of us, like, we, how do they explain within their framework of what creates development China? And then because they can't explain China, they get the Nobel Prize. I find that as a very strong contradiction. And in fact, a lot of economists, not even just radical economists, are really wondering what came into the Nobel Committee that they gave the prize to folks who cannot explain how how uh, rapid development takes place
Well,
in
I mean,
supposed authoritarian
this was
states.
in many ways kind of, I don't know, belated gift to them. I'd rather have the other great Turkish economist, Danny Roderick, one economics menu recipe.
Yes.
I think he got it much more correctly. In addition to Yuan and a couple of China, origin scholars based in the U.S. who are saying like this is essentially an ideological argument that basically, if you go to the final chapters of the How Nations Fail, they have zero policy recommendation. They have just some pathetic attempt at looking at Party Trabajador of Brazil to kind of say maybe, but they admitted they have no policy recommendation. And by the way, they're
Yeah.
not one of them is a historian. There's a one political scientist there, Robinson's, but none of them are historians. So the joke about them is this is what happens when economists try to do history, and by
Yeah.
history they forget everything that Hajung Chan and all sorts of different political economists, including yourself, have been focusing on. So this is where you see the neoliberal ideology really affecting so-called scientific or quasi-scientific research. But I want to go back to this, Walden, because one of the things I don't hear in the Darren Achimagla is the popular books. In fairness to Darren's, is yung mga journal articles niya mas sophisticated, mas elegant. But anyway, the more popular version, I barely hear industrial policy, right? Which I think now it's almost impossible to ignore. In Washington, D.C., the heartland of neoliberalism, in Germany, right, the most developed manufacturing-driven economy, all of them are desperately scrambling to up their game in industrial policy in response to China. So, can you explain to us paano isang bansa katulad ng China ay naging ganyan ka-successful pagdating sa industrial policy? How did they go from zero to hero, literally? Barely any car exports 5 or 10 years ago in terms of high-end markets to now BYD as number one and Geely and Neo and all of them competing. And actually, this watch I have is barely 1,000 pesos and it looks way better. It's a Chinese brand I got. It's way nicer than the Richard Milles, which are millions of dollars. Like, this is my way of saying this is how can you compete with this?
Sure.
They can
Sure.
build things at dirt cheap cost and very high quality, very high quality.
Sure.
Can you explain the industrial policy part? How is this about? Is this ideological? Is it because of their institutional foundations? And the other way, not a disagreement, Walden, but in fairness, I think even Mao Zedong repeatedly went back to China's own history to drive emotional inspiration, if not
Sure.
lessons, right?
Sure.
And that's why China and the Vietnamese have been doing the same. I think every successful model of economic development was in touch with its historical background. I can talk about Turkey also, another interesting case, right? Of a relatively successful late developing economy with a proud history. But going back to this, where's this industrial policy of China is coming from? Is this just a photocopy of what MITI was doing in Japan, what the Koreans were doing during Park Chung-hee, or is this something different altogether? Because China is my goodness, it's beating the West in its own game at a very low level of development. I mean, per capita wise, it's still just a barely high income country.
Well, yes. Again, let me just start by saying that, uh, post-war, since the Second World War, uh, you know, all the key successful industrializing countries have in fact been practiced industrial policy. Basically, the use of the state to pick winners in the economic field, whether it's South Korea or Japan or Taiwan or Thailand or Malaysia, the tiger cubs,
Even
there was
Indonesia.
always a
Even
yeah,
Indonesia.
I've been in Indonesia. There was always, this interaction, close interaction between the state and the private sector. Now, of course, that had some of its costs. There was some corruption there, but nevertheless, for the most part, I would say that it was sort of a successful meeting of the state and the private sector. And when it comes to China, this is it's fairly clear here that industrial policy had characteristics of its own. I think, first of all, technology acquisition, especially in the advanced technological sector, that was always foremost in the Chinese Communist Party's mind, whether it was in manufacturing, in the car industry, in steel, in plastics, in terms of foreign investment coming in. There was always that quid pro quo. You come in, you have access to cheap labor, but you have to be open to transferring technology. And the thing is that some of the Western writers say this is forced technology transfer. It's not. Okay, if you're going to come into China and you say, okay, fine, we'll give you access to cheap labor, but you give us access to
Access
your
to 500
technology.
million people. I mean, that's quite a good bargain, isn't it?
Right, right. That's a bargain. China was just being hard-nosed capitalist bargainers in terms of that, right?
I'm saying these
So
are communists who are the best salesmen and negotiators. I
sure,
mean,
sure, sure. And then the other thing is what distinguished, I think, China from the other Asian countries like Japan and South Korea was that they were very relaxed when it came to foreign investment. They were in fact saying, come in," and basically, because they knew what they wanted. They wanted foreign investment to come in, comprehensively develop the Chinese economy, but in the meantime, we'll get technology from you guys. Whereas that kind of openness to foreign investment
was not there
was
in South
really
Korean
there
model. Yeah, was not there.
in Japan or in
Yeah.
South Korea. Or so and the second thing is that when it came to industrial policy, of course, there were sensitive sections like aircraft industry and very high-tech industry, security-related industries that were off limits to foreign investment. But nevertheless, in most areas of the Chinese economy, the foreign investment was welcomed. And the thing is this: the state has had a very strong role in so many of these major high-tech industries. But what has been clear about China has been the state participation has been mainly at the local level. It's local governments that have been very central in attracting investments and working with the different private sectors, Chinese or foreign corporations there, so that it's not like it was this command central government ministries that were sort of the dynamic factor here. It was really local governments. Now, of course, if you leave a lot of the planning including industrial policy to the local level, you're going to have a lot of waste. You're going to have a lot of duplication. You're going to have a lot of overcapacity. But that's the negative side. But the positive side is that you do have advances because you have a close cooperation between local authorities and the private sector in these different areas. So there are negative and positive sides to it, but I think the positive sides have been shown to be the balance. The balance has been positive, and we've seen that now when it comes to electric vehicles, when it comes to deep sea, when it comes to robotics. They just had all these different local governments got together in Shanghai to run a robotics school, where they're very fast in terms of developing robotics to the point of humanoid robots being able to take over caring functions for human beings, So basically, what I would say is unique about the Chinese model is one, you have a welcoming of foreign investment, provided that there is the quid pro quo of technology transfer. The second thing is local government plays the key role rather than the central government. But the overall thing that makes this positive is a fairly strong state compared to other states in the developing countries that can partner and be confident in its relationship with the West. So I think this is the sort of combination of different factors that has made the Chinese model quite unique at this point in time, and led it, as we said, from being outside the global capitalist system as late as 1972 to, according to the New York Times, to the top dog in the global capitalist system at this point in time. That is, in fact, very unique, and one cannot. I don't think we can understand Trump and what's happening in the United States right now, the chaos that's happening, especially in the government in the United States, without realizing that this has been the Trump phenomenon has been basically a reaction to the advance of China.
Well,
So,
just to be clear, Trump's foray into geoeconomics was when he was panicking over Japanese companies buying things right and left in the 1980s, and he even paid from his own pocket to have a whole page on New York Times pushing for tariffs. So you're absolutely right. This kind of a yellow, scare has been a big, big element of Trumpian nativism and protectionism. We can absolutely discuss it. Well, then obviously later on, para lang maging relevant ito sa Pilipinas, you have talked about all of these elements that are unique to China, but are there lessons that we can learn from them? But before going there, I want
oh,
to focus on I want to focus on two elements first before we go to
sure.
the lessons for others. One thing we notice in all quote unquote socialistic countries. This can go from ex-Soviet systems like Poland to full totalitarian regimes, hermit regimes like North Korea, to semi-socialistic systems like Iran, for instance, and definitely China, Russia. They have very strong foundations in STEM and sciences, right? So if you look at the five top countries when it comes to production of engineers, you'll see Russia, you'll see China by far, and then you'll see Iran, right? And then other socialistic countries are not too far away, or ex-socialist countries. To what degree is also that strong educational foundation a key thing? Because they don't run out of engineers. There are twice as many engineers produced in China every year than the United States, and they come very cheap, right?
Mm.
And it comes from socialized housing and everything like that. To what degree is that educational excellence a key, human capital key to China's success? And then second, why is the Chinese bureaucracy so innovative? I mean, I would say that instead of going to Singapore to learn about public policy, everyone has to go to Tsinghua or Beida, because the Chinese Ministry of Commerce or whatever counterparts they have there, they're just so good in making sure that the Tencents and the ByteDance do not dominate the system. They scare the hell out of the monopolistic big tech companies. They make sure they're commissars to make sure that they follow the national line and there's no concentration of wealth. Obviously, that raises concerns about politics and intervention and all. But by and far, I prefer the Chinese way of keeping the big tech companies and the billionaires in check than the kind of crazy oligarchy we're seeing of major democracies like the United States, to be honest. And I'm not even communist. I'm very critical of communism, but I'll give it to China. They have very efficient bureaucracy. Where does that come from, Walden? Because our bureaucracy has been horrible. We tried industrial policy very unsuccessfully. Our Latin American counterparts slightly more successful, but still, the history of industrial policy in the 20th century was for every one or two successful cases, there were easily eight disastrous cases. So what explains China's case? Before we talk about what are the lessons for the Philippines.
Well, I think that when we look at the Soviet Union and the centralized socialist states in Eastern Europe and China before the Deng Xiaoping's capitalist revolution, as you might call it, what you had was basically, the market was basically abolished in these countries, right? You had central planning. And what I think, but nevertheless, I would say that in the case of China, for instance, despite that, the government was, in its pursuit of development, did provide very strong opportunities in education, especially in the sciences and in technological developments. That was there even before Deng Xiaoping came in, right? So I fully agree that. And with many people, they say, "Oh, don't underestimate what happened in China during the Mao period, because there was growth of 4.2% a year, which was practically the same as in Europe at that point in time." So there was that. But nevertheless, I think what we had with Deng and later on was this successful merging of releasing market forces, but at the same time being able to gear them in certain directions through the intervention of the state, and the state from the central government down to the local governments participating in this process. Now, as I said, as people have rightfully said, that there was a lot of innovation here, there was a lot of positive stuff, but there was also corruption. There was also a lot of
But
waste.
efficient corruption, right? Again, the argument was a lot of corruption in China is what you call access corruption rather than grand theft corruption. It's not what Marcos or Sukarno did, which is
Yeah.
steal the money, put it in Singapore, Switzerland. It was like steal the money, put it in a factory in Guangdong, right? So the
Yeah.
variety of corruption matters. And this is important when we'll talk about
Yeah.
Philippines shortly, that corruption
Yeah.
per se doesn't explain national development.
Oh
No,
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, definitely. I think this is where the neoliberals got it all wrong. That in focusing on corruption as the source of underdevelopment, we asked them, but what about Korea? What about Taiwan? What about China, where
what
corruption?
about US Gilded Age? My goodness,
Sure, right,
literally Gilded Age. And
sure,
yet they were growing at 9,
sure,
10% and became a superpower. I mean, it's just
sure.
so historically ignoramus that really
Yeah,
it
yeah.
befuddles me. How did these people get through their history courses?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one thing that the very bad influence really of neoliberal education, especially at the University of the Philippines, has on our development policies because it has, well, we need not go into that at this point in time. But the point, I think, is that coming back to industrial policy, as I said in another program, with you, I had said, that um, what differentiates us from China and from even our neighbors was that even as our neighbors, technocrats, talked about free markets uh, and saying that the free market and less government, et cetera, their practice was different. They were, in fact, regulating the market. Government intervention was key, whether it's from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Korea. You had technocrats that basically practiced industrial policy, even while they spouted free markets to satisfy the IMF and the World Bank people. And the problem here is that, and here we're unique in Asia, because we had technocrats that really believed in the free markets, you know, and practiced what they preached, which was let's deregulate like hell. Let's get the government out of intervening in the economy, and let's just let the market reign. And this is the tragedy of the Philippines, that we had technocrats that really believed in the market and practiced the market, the free market doctrine. Whereas in all our neighbors, okay, they rhetorically they paid obeisance to the market, but they basically exercised strong state intervention in the economy and practice industrial policy. They did not practice what they preach. And this is why it's great sometimes not to practice what you preach. And sometimes it is very bad when, in fact, you practice what you preach, as in the case of the Philippines. And this is the reason why we really now have a big development problem in the Philippines, in terms of where
But what is
our
what is
economy will be going.
But again, Walden, like, okay, I think we're very clear that we're exceptionally negative in that sense. This is
Mhm.
negative exceptionalism. I and Leloy have been discussing this for a long time. Leloy's upcoming book is precisely about the history of where does this crazy fiscal conservatism come from, right? This kind of a late 19th century gold standard American fiscal conservatism, very out of place, very anti-development state, as you put it in your fantastic book a few decades ago. Where is this coming from? Is this the American influence? Is this the overly over receptiveness of our educational academic elites? Or lagay natin sa madaling salita, madali ba tayong mauto at ma-impress sa mga AFAM? Meaning yung mga Ivy League school kung saan nag-aaral ng mga kapatid natin,
Yeah.
kaibigan natin. Parang kasi kita natin sa ibang bansa, nag-aaral sila abroad, katulad mo. Pero hindi sila nabudol. Parang they just went there to realize, this is what they tell themselves. Like, okay, but we're not gonna follow it. We're just gonna pretend it by speaking the
Correct.
language but not doing it. Because you go to Singapore, you go to United Arab Emirates, you go to Turkey, you see all of these guys who are MBA graduates in Harvard. But when you look at how they operate in real life, it's nothing like what they're taught. So they just know how to speak the language for external audience.
By the way, talk about a technocratic country where the state has a very strong role at all levels of the economy and all levels of society. It's Singapore, okay? I mean, we're talking about
The
a
police state
political
almost.
economy that is so different from the Philippines, because you really have it's almost like a nanny welfare state, but that's so basically, where does this come from? I think it's combination of a couple of things. One is a reaction to the corruption of the Marcos period. Um, and there was this sense that uh, there was so much crony capitalism there that the only way to get out of that was by complete deregulation. That's one thing. The second thing was the neoliberal revolution, which took over the American economic graduate school system from Keynesianism in the late 70s, 1980s. Because previous to that, it was Keynesian economics that had a very strong role for the state that dominated thinking. So, so a lot of our technocrats went to the Ivy League schools, the University of Chicago, and all of that during that period when Keynesianism was being overthrown and neoliberalism was coming in. And then the third thing was really the very strong role of the IMF and the World Bank in the Philippine economy, because compared to the other East Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries, we had the IMF and the World Bank had a very, very, very strong influence in terms of the direction of the policies, partly because Marcos had invited them in, and then partly because of the debt crisis when Corazon Aquino was, basically the basic demand that the banks was to pay off the $26 billion, and to do that, she had to appeal to the World Bank and to the IMF to come in to provide, the loans that would allow that repayment to take place. So it's those a reaction to cronyism, the training under neoliberalism in American graduate schools, and thirdly, the World Bank and the IMF having such a very strong stranglehold over the direction of our political economy that was not there when it came to other countries in Southeast Asia. So I would say that that's when you had the neoliberal kind of free market thing institutionalized and naturalized in the Philippines to the point that we just allowed this kind of mentality to complete for state regulation or a vanguard state role in development. So that's what I would say explains the key factors that explains why we ended up with the terrible political economy that we now have, which has seen the destruction of our manufacturing, the destruction of our agriculture, and labor export really becoming, the principal source of dynamism in the economy, and even the business processing activities at this point in time that was sometimes seen way back as the frontier of the future. Even that is no longer really a source of dynamism for the economy. So that's how I would put that, Richard.
Thank you again. I mean, this is also where the sociologist in you is very useful understanding. Well, actually, it's more like almost Foucauldian, right? Like structures of knowledge and power, creating this very negative dialectic, if I can use that term, right? Very Adorno, which is this really self-defeating policy framework. Plus, so you have already problematic. I mean, you already have hapless technocrats combined with super corrupt grand theft type of oligarchy. You're never really gonna get that far. But well, then, and now I want to transition really to the Philippines because this is, I mean, I'm sure you and Adam too had a fantastic discussion about China. I'm quite familiar also with this point of view, and I wonder if you had any disagreements at all because you seem to think along similar lines. But I want to talk about the Philippines aspect here. Unang-una, ano yung basa mo kay Duterte? Because Duterte was the only president in recent memory, I can imagine, not even Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, who openly talked about the Chinese development model as the way forward. I remember the first interview he had with CGTN when he was in his serious mode, in perfect English almost, and in a very eloquent way, even I would say. He just explained, help my country to develop. And he was talking about how amazed he was with all of these things we mentioned, China lifting 600 million people out of poverty in 30 years, China high-speed railway, etc. So Duterte is a well-read man in the sense that he knows things outside the West. He's not your typical Filipino liberal oligarch who's all about what happens in Paris, London, and US, but was very in tune with what was happening in China. What is your understanding of the Duterte in historical and sociological terms? Was he kind of a potential counter-hegemonic bloc, if I can use the Gramscian terms? Was he like such a false vessel that he may have undermined the message? Because as we speak, Walden, I know you see it a lot. You get a lot of bashing whenever you say anything positive about China. Even I get a lot of bashing for saying positive things about China. It's like, oh, so you're saying we should give up in West Philippines? Like, whoa, wait, ibang usapan yan. Let's just take China on its own terms and the incredible things it has achieved. What is your read of that, Walden? Duterte, where does Duterte come in? Because he kind of shattered that autopilot, love, 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 US, hate, hate, hate China kind of modus operandi in the Philippine oligarchy, right?
Yeah, but I would say that yes, I think there was an element of being fascinated by China and where it was going, you know. But whether he had absorbed the right lessons from that was something else. There was, in fact, this rhetorical turn from the United States to China, and which might uh, have been mainly triggered by the reactions to his drug war policies. So
No,
I
I
would.
would agree with that, Walden. I would, you know why? I watched his interview with Maria Ressa in 2015. I always found it interesting that our Rappler friends always, projected themselves as the ones who held the line. But I'll tell you what, the only person who really bothered to have an hour or two conversation with Duterte when he was a fringe was Maria Ressa. Watch that interview in 2015. No one was paying attention to Duterte, and Maria Ressa sat down 1 hour with him. They had conversation, and Duterte said many reasonable things about like we had 100 years of U.S. Where did that get us? Did the Americans stand by us? Like he was sounding very reasonable and all of that. I remember when they had
Sure.
the debate of choose my leader, whatever in LaSalle when I was teaching in LaSalle. Maria Ressa was the host. Again, Duterte was the only one who showed up, and he sounded very reasonable to a lot of my students were impressed with him. I was never impressed with him. I always saw a proto-fascist in him, just like you. But I always also understood maybe not maybe that he was needed. I mean, that's a little bit teleological, but in a way, he has helped us to shatter that kind of a blind pro-American ideology that I think also has.
Well, there
Yeah.
was definitely, and there was definitely an influence of the nationalist movement in Duterte. When he even admitted this, that when he went to school, he was in the Lyceum, he was impacted on by
His own
Jones's.
was it. Yeah.
And so there was that element of Duterte that was made him probably receptive to what was happening in China, and made him in many ways also anti-West, But how deep was that is what I would question, and how much of what evolved in terms of the succeeding relations with the West and China during his administration um, came from his uh, drug war policies. So there seemed to be this synergy whereby, the more he got enmeshed in human rights EJKs, the more he seemed to blast the United States.
He needed
So,
support. He needed boss to protect him, right?
sure,
Exactly.
sure,
So what you're
sure.
saying is that it was very instrumental, it was
Sure.
very coincidental, and it was not really ideologically grounded and all. But maybe Walden, we were
But
being
but but
unfair.
but I would say this
Mhm.
though, that even as I was criticizing Duterte, for his for on the human rights area for the AJ case, I was also saying, that there was a potential for him to make move the Philippines away from the United States in terms of abrogating the agreements. In fact, I wrote this article for Rappler, the title of which Duterte may be a mass murderer, but when it comes to withdrawing from the VFA, the Visiting Forces Agreement, I wish he would do that. So for me, there was a lot of rhetoric around nationalism and attacking the U.S., but for me, the important thing was really, how much of substantial was it? Because by the end of his term, he had withdrawn his statements about abrogating the VFA. He was praising the U.S.
For the
The U.S.
vaccines.
AUKUS, and basically ending his term with a very congenial relationship to Washington compared to the way that he started off with an antagonistic relationship with Obama. So, I guess I guess my sense is that there was a lot of rhetorical promise there, but just like in so many other areas, he did not deliver. And I don't think he really thought through many of these political economy policies. And practically just when it came to the economy, Richard, he just completely turned it over to the neoliberal technocrats, to
And Pogo.
Dominguez.
And
Yeah,
Pogo. No, no, the reason I say that, Walden, is because we're forgetting a big factor here, right? A big factor here is the Philippine military and the security establishment, which I
yeah,
know for a fact because I've been dealing a lot with them. I don't think they allowed really Duterte to do Duterte. I think Duterte was really circumscribed. This is not to give an excuse, but I think Duterte was not really the final arbiter when it comes to our foreign policy.
no, I
But
think
that's
that.
one. But the other one, Walden, is China also did not deliver in terms of the big infrastructure projects. We can have a long discussion about the reasons behind it, but give me a single big ticket Chinese infrastructure project worth mentioning. You're gonna have a hard time. You're gonna have a hard time. I'm not talking about some bridge here and some whatever questionable dam there. Not a single Mindanao railway, etc. So I also blame China for not using that golden opportunity to turn an American semi-colony, supposedly, into a country with options, right? Like Turkey is a NATO ally, but they have fantastic relationship with China, Russia, and Iran. South Korea is a US treaty ally. They have fantastic economic relationship with China, right?
Sure,
And as even
sure.
Iran at some point. So being a US ally should never stop you from having a multi-aligned or much more diversified relationship. But my problem is that China did not give the Philippines anything. Is it
Yeah.
because Duterte is just an idiot that is not worth even investing in?
No, I fully agree with you that China did not deliver, and that that's part of the reason that Duterte really turned back in his last days to the West, to the United States. The second thing is in terms of the relationships to um, in terms of the domestic relationship with respect to the left in the Philippines, with respect to the CPP and the NPA, that yes, Duterte was circumscribed in that he might have wanted to really seek a peace deal, but he was not allowed to do that by the Philippine military, which he was trying to get the support of. And but I think when it came to foreign policy, he had much more space there, especially when it came to foreign aid, foreign assistance. I mean, he had much more space there. And I said part of the problem was China did not deliver. But when it came to what we're talking about, political economy, domestic economic policy, he completely handed that over to people like Dominguez and to Diokno and to the neoliberal technocrats. Because as he said several times,
You don't need that. He
he
doesn't know economics, right?
yeah, he was saying that he's not an economist, but Remember, Duterte, when his first victory speech in Davao, I know this because I listened very closely, he basically traced the Philippines' agricultural problems to the World Trade Organization and to the demands that the World Trade Organization was making in terms of policy, that the Philippines had to scrap a lot of its agricultural policies to make investments, agricultural investments, basically deprotectionize Philippine agriculture. I was listening to that speech and I said, oh, this guy must have been reading some of the stuff that we've been writing about the World Trade Organization.
Don't be
But then
surprised he read you. Yeah, yeah.
but then he comes to power and he forgets all about these criticisms of neoliberalism, the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF. And the excuse he says is that he doesn't understand economics. So so basically I think this is why when it comes to, I mean, discussing this person, Duterte, I mean, he was full of contradictions. Okay.
He's
And
not flamboyant. He's a complex character. But
right.
if I can put it
And
that way, I think the way to square the circle is there's the Duterte, the aspiration, meaning people projecting their hopes on him. That's why some of our friends in the left even join his cabinet thinking that, oh, he's a
sure,
socialist,
sure.
whatever. And then there's a Duterte who's like Sabog. He's just not meant, he doesn't have the mental capacity, to be honest. He just doesn't have what it takes. And then there's Duterte who got corrupted by power, basically, and went berserk, right? So all of those Dutertes coincide. And I think we shouldn't be surprised because this was a guy who entered into power. First of all, I think he was never prepared for that level of power. Second, I think he was not surrounded by the right people. Horrible people around him. Horrible people. I mean, even Donald Trump couldn't put it as horrible people. And then really opportunistic people. I think Ronald Llamas was telling the story of when the Chinese investors would come to the Philippines. There were guys who would come with the business card saying they are governor of the Visayan Islands. Like they were like made up people posing as special economic zone chief. I mean, it was shady people after shady people until even the Chinese were turned off. Like this is fourth world country. Like what the heck is going on, right? So
Sure.
Ronald was saying, actually, I pity the Chinese who wanted to invest here. These are all Budul kings, like little Dutertes popping up from everywhere. All these shady, dodgy people. So again, I try to be fair about it, but well, then moving forward, I think we don't want to rehash the long conversation we had about EDCA and all. I think people are aware that we have slight tactical differences, but we strategically agree that the Philippines has to be more self-reliant and self-independent. So I want to ask you this question, which Secretary Lorenzano, who attended my lecture in Manila House the other week, thank you very much, by the way, for hosting my Age of Disruption talk on everything from AI, populism, and China. He wanted to ask me, and he didn't manage to, and hopefully we'll have him here. I joked to Secretary Lorenzano, I want to make you my defense guy the way I made Ronald Diamas my political guy, because now he's retired, so he can speak more openly. He wanted to ask me, should the Philippines join BRICS? Is BRICS, what is your take on BRICS? Is BRICS like Bitcoin, a lot of hype, not much foundation? Is BRICS just a way of signaling discontent with the hypocrisies of the West? Or maybe there's much more to BRICS that Indonesia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Vietnam, Thailand have either joined or about to join or showing interest to join, that maybe this is not just a kind of a Goldman Sachs catchy portfolio, that this is a geopolitical force to reckon with for years and decades to come. I was just in Malaysia for ASEAN conference. The Malaysians are interested also in joining in BRICS. What is your read on this BRICS? Because Walden, you and I have been looking at the rise of the new, of the Bandung conference and the non-aligned movement. We have been here, right? All these non-Western powers trying to challenge the West and failing from one decade to the other. The new international economic order in the 70s. Is it different this time with BRICS? Do you think BRICS represents a seismic shift in the global geopolitical balance of power? And is it only because of China, really? Or maybe it's more than China?
Well, I would say that there are several things. I think the the main actor in BRICS is really China in terms of the resources that it has brought to the BRICS. Okay. Uh, and um, and basically, when China is in the BRICS, we're talking about its control over the Asian investment um,
AIB.
development
Bank.
bank.
Yeah, yeah.
We're talking about its Belt and Road Initiative promise of $1 trillion investments through in Asia and Africa. Uh, so China has been the sort of mainstay of BRICS. That's the first thing. The second thing I think is that you already have certain institutions in BRICS that they have developed, like the New Development Bank, which is sort of a mini World Bank at this point. You
Shanghai.
have the contingency reserve arrangement, which is a kind of a mini IMF. And basically, these have been kept purposely underdeveloped, mainly because I don't think they want to be seen as rivals to the World Bank and the IMF.
Or
Okay.
rivals to China's BRI, because this is where I want to push back a little bit, Walden,
Sure.
because if you talk to Indians, and I was talking to Indians in New Delhi the other week, they're part of the BRICS, right? You
Mhm.
talk to South Africans and Brazilians, they're kind of worried that the BRICS is being hijacked by the Chinese agenda, to a certain degree, Russia-China axis, right?
Mhm.
And that the BRICS is just a foil for really a Chinese new form of imperialism, whatever you want to call it. Uh,
Mhm.
considering we're Filipinos and nakikita natin yung pagbubuli sa West Philippine Sea, and I think none of us should have any illusions about China's totalitarian system, without being, of course, blind to the horrible decay of so-called democracy in the West, not to mention our own democracy. Well then, aren't you, because my sense with you, Alden, is you belong to the tradition that is super happy to finally see someone giving it to them, right? Like that we're not just stuck with the ugly Americans and the snobby Europeans dictating the international order. Am I getting this wrong? Because my worry here is I'm all for balancing the US and making sure they're not the only game in town, because they have done horrible things in Iraq, Middle East, a lot of places in the world close to my heart. But at the same time, I'm also worried that China might be poisoned by the same imperial temptations that took America in the wrong direction in the past, and other rising empires in the past half a millennium. Or am I being too xenophobic? Oh well, then do you think I'm too anti-communist? Or maybe we should make sure we're not complacent. What is your read on that? Because well, then my fear
Yeah.
is, and I think that came up in our discussion with Ronald, that you are more than right to emphasize America's unreliability, etc. But my feeling is I'm all good with that to a certain degree, but I think we shouldn't be also complacent about China and its own potentially nefarious imperial ambitions. Shouldn't we?
Yes. Yeah, I'll return to that, but I'm just trying to say that when we look at the BRICS and the institutional development of the BRICS, which I think is still at an early stage, okay, uh, we need to see this in the context of the crisis of the US dominated multilateral system, which is the crisis of the World Trade Organization, the crisis of the IMF, and the crisis of the World Bank, which has really accelerated over the last several decades. So the that multilateral system is going to pieces, and this is why the BRICS, is very attractive to many countries in the global South. And the fact that you had Saudi Arabia, which has this uh,
Biggest reserve of oil in the world. Yeah, yeah.
sovereign wealth fund of $1 trillion, and the
The Emiratis
UAE.
are also, and Marathis too are also there. The
Right. Uh, you're right. So there is this sense that this BRICS, which has survived despite some of the contradictions among its members, seems to be the game in town that's going to replace the multilateral system, which dominated by the West, which incidentally, Trump seems to be intent also in tearing up. Okay, so basically, I think what we're seeing is that you have the rise of the BRICS coinciding with the crisis of the US of the multilateral system dominated by the United States, leading many countries to think that, oh, you know, maybe the way to go at this point is to join, the BRICS. And hopefully that it will in fact institutionalize itself, provide resources for development and that sort of thing. So I think there's that expectancy and hope from many developing countries at this point with respect to that. So this is why, this is why I think that it's being touted as the alternative multilateral system, not only because of people of countries joining it, but also because of the crisis of the Western-dominated multilateral system. Now, having said that, of course, we have to be very careful about China and other big powers. And the thing that we need to look at, though, is this, that when we look at China's foray into global markets, I think there's one thing that's very clear. It's very different from the way that the West rose. Because with the West, it was violence all the way. Whereas China, basically, you have, you cannot, ever since it became a global trading partner since the late 1990s, basically its expansion has been quite peaceful into global markets. Yes, there have been some problems with respect to this, Chinese laborers being brought to Africa and that sort of thing. But overall, I think the record has shown that China's expansion globally has not had the kind of violence that has been associated with the West. Secondly,
But Walden, isn't that very questionable in light of the fact that the West had like 400-500 years to mess around, and China only had 5 to 10 years, right? And I
sure,
want to go Lenin, right? The Leninist line is very clear. It's inevitable that any imperial capitalist power at some point is going to go down the violent lane. So I find that argument quite suspect because it kind of orientalizes China as an exceptional rising power. When, to be
I'm not
honest,
saying that.
I don't think
I'm
they're
not,
that exceptional. I mean,
I'm not, I'm not saying that. All that I'm saying is that we have to be very empirical in terms of our judgments. And if you're going to compare the West with China's expansion, I think China's expansion has been relatively nonviolent. Sure, it's 25 to 30 years, and you have the West's expansion from the very beginning associated with violence. So I'm just trying to say is that we really need to make judgments based on an empirical basis. Second, you look at all the loans that China has made. There is very little proof that it has encouraged countries to go into the debt trap. In fact, that's already been discredited. The idea that it's been making loans to get people into the debt trap,
well,
including.
pledge trap, Walden. I mean, in the case of Philippines, barely anything came in. I call it pledge trap because it was like boodle,
Sure,
right?
sure,
But you're
sure,
right. A lot of exaggeration around it, unless you're talking about, I don't know, Laos or a few countries.
sure,
Again,
sure,
I'm absolutely right. That I think you're also coming from the fact that the structural adjustment programs, the whole
sure,
banana republic
sure,
phenomenon of U.S.
sure,
companies. So against that grain, you're saying that it's quite hypocritical, in fact, shameless of Western commentators to talk about China's negativity when they themselves have a very dark history, fraught history to come to terms with. On that, I agree. I just want to do this because I think I don't want to give an impression to people that we're here to just sing, the China's praises. That we're really
No, no,
looking
no, no.
critically at all aspects of China as a rising
Sure.
superpower.
Yeah, I mean, there are problems with Chinese projects. They're gigantistic. Arundhati Roy says that you don't have this top-down gigantistic projects. Sure, there are those problems, but basically, to then call China imperialistic in that sense is, is an exaggeration, I would say, in terms of comparing it to the record of the West. Now, of
What
course,
about
there's
the West Philippine Sea, Walden?
the West Philippines.
Isn't that a
Yeah,
form of imperialism,
well,
trying to claim the
is
entire South China Sea basin as their own? I mean, again,
right.
isn't that whataboutism? It's like, oh, but U.S. like killed 10 million people here. But for me, like,
No,
this
no,
is
no.
imperialism. It's
No,
just
no, but
first.
this is a continuation of what we said the other day, right? I definitely China's moves in the West Philippine Sea are the wrong kinds of moves. They're unilateral and that sort of thing. They violate international law. And I think that should be made very clear, as I have in terms of my own criticisms of China. At the same time, we also need to look at where they're coming from in terms of their, as we said last time, that their defensive capabilities, what they're really are reacting to is the threat posed by US power to the mainland, especially to Southeast China, where most of their industrial infrastructure is located. I think where we ended up last time was I
Yeah,
was pointing.
you're saying that it's defensive on the part of China, while we felt that the U.S. containment is more an excuse for China, or that but the two can go hand in hand, right? China can be imperialistic to smaller neighbors while it's trying to be defensive towards a bigger empire. I mean, can that? And well, you're saying China is already the biggest economy, so they're not like a pipsqueak. It's hard to see
Yeah,
China
sure.
here, is it?
Sure. No, but what I'm trying to say here is that if we look at China's relationships with the global South, okay, I think that overall it's been quite positive. When it comes to its neighbors like Vietnam and the Philippines, uh, where there are unresolved territorial issues, sovereignty issues, okay, this is where China's moves become very problematic. Okay, it has resolved some of those problems with Laos, with um, Cambodia, with Vietnam. Um, uh, but when it comes to the South China Sea, uh, which we're really talking about a body of water that for a long time was no man's or water, except when UNCLOS came into being. This is where we have the key parts of the problem. We're not talking about China being a threat to Luzon or Visayas or to Mindanao. We're not talking about China being a threat to Vietnam. We're talking about basically a body of water where we've had major blurring of territorial issues, partly from a colonial legacy. But nevertheless, having said that, as I said last time, let's demilitarize the area, and then and after that, let's talk about the territorial issues. I did have, I was telling you I had this 4-point plan that I was
Yeah.
offering to the Chinese and the Philippine government back then. So all I'm trying to say here is that yes, we have to be very wary about China, but then to say that it is an imperial power in the image of the West, I don't think that holds
Well,
water.
in its own image, maybe. I mean, imperialism, 50 shades of imperialism, right? Whether it's, I don't know, new Ottomanism in Syria to Russian, mumbo jumbos in Georgia and Central Asia to. So, I mean, for me,
Yeah,
but I'm
but
comparing it to the West to downplay it. I just feel, Walden, that's a bit of
no,
a tenuous argument, in my
I'm
opinion.
not trying to downplay it. I'm just trying to push back against the exaggerations made by the United
New Cold Warriors,
States
by the New
and
Cold Warriors.
Western
Yes,
intellectuals, you know,
you're
in which they capture the minds of Filipinos with just easy phrases and that sort of thing. And I think we must always say, let's look at the empirical facts, of the matter. Okay, and let's look at both sides, and then having come to that, let's propose solutions which are practical. And that's what I'm really after at this point. Criticize the Chinese, yes, but not to the point of going over and just buying into the
Demonizing them,
American
yeah, and demonizing
containment
them.
strategy. That's so basically I'm just trying to say, let's really look at what's going on in the ground, the facts on the ground. So what I would say, therefore, Richard, is that even as we struggle, you know, for a position on the West Philippine Sea issue that we can get the Chinese to respect, let's also make sure we don't fall into the kind of ideological and political containment strategy that's been pushed by the United States. At the same time, let us not go into this with our eyes wide
Yeah,
shut,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh, about China's own, great power ambitions,
Right.
but to therefore say that it's just another imperialist power, just like the West, I think that is not a legitimate argument. That's really not based so much on, that's not based on facts. Let's, and this is why my research has always been trying to get the facts out of a situation.
Well, if imperialism is too harsh a word for you, and maybe the West should have a copyright on that, I'll use the term hegemonic ambition. I mean, I think Gramsci's sense of hegemony is quite. I mean, let's be honest, China wants a kind of a new tributary system. The way they treat smaller nations. For anyone who has dealt with the Chinese, it's pretty clear to that. Again, this is not to say the Americans are treating us Asians any better in genuine terms, but then again, I think what we have arrived at here, Walden, is that both of us want a Goldilocks approach, whereby um you don't demonize China and fall into this new Cold Warrior trap, and at the same time you're not completely like Duterte style, come over, make us a province of China, kind of an idiot. So just to be clear about it, so it's just a question of how do you get that balance. And that's why I appreciate this discussion and back and forth. I hope you're okay with this, Walden, because I don't know how many people you meet like me who are kind of left, but at the same time a little bit hawkish, right? So I always felt it's good when we have this back and forth because it really sharpens the argument. I think for both of us, I hope you feel the same in the same way I feel
Oh
when I
yeah.
with
But
you.
for me, the important thing is, yes, there is this rivalry between the United States and China. And for me, the important thing is, how do we, smaller countries, the global south, make use of this rivalry to be able to create policy space for us, in order to be able to create the space necessary for our development. And I think this is where countries, for instance, in Africa, have been very good at being able to get Chinese aid, whether it's loans or grants, and making sure that they do not come with the kind of conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank have put into their aid. This is why, again, the point is that you go to Latin America and you go to Africa. You don't find this sort of negative view of China as being another imperial power. Sure, there are criticisms of specific Chinese policies, but to compare them to the way that the United States is, I don't think you don't have that kind of blanket kind of dismissal of China as just another imperial hegemon. Again, what are the facts on the ground? That's where the important thing really is.
So, last part of our discussion, Walden. So, moving forward, I ask you, for instance, should we join the BRICS? Do you think? I mean, obviously, I don't think this administration right now is interested, but in theory, let's say we have the next president of the Philippines. Is the Philippines joining the BRICS the next reasonable step? Because we're already one of the biggest economies in Asia. We're one of the fastest growing. We're the top 12 countries in terms of population, top 10 soon. It makes sense for us to be part of a grouping like BRICS, right? Like the non-Western, quite major enough countries. Isn't it? Doesn't that make sense?
I would say so. I mean, I think that the BRICS, as we talked about this, it's still in a process of consolidation. I think, and this is probably what motivates countries like Malaysia and Thailand to come in there on the ground floor
Vietnam.
in Vietnam, so that they're not left into a process whereby when they want to join, wala na. You know, that basically you have already a solidification of the BRICS. If we join now, by the way, which is not guaranteed, right? I mean,
Oh,
it
by the way,
really
I'm just saying our interest in joining. Obviously, China will have a
sure,
veto, and I doubt they'll agree to that. But I'm
sure.
sure the Indians, Brazilians, and the South Africans would love to have us there because they want
Sure,
more similar democracies, quote unquote, to join the
sure,
club.
sure,
But it
sure.
would be a very fraught negotiation,
So
to be honest.
that's why I would say that this is the time to join rather than have join at a time when it has become consolidated and has rules and that sort of thing. We can help determine the rules.
Shaping.
Uh,
So we're still in the shaping phase. So might as well be
yeah,
there at the moment of creation, if I can put
yeah,
it in more biblical terms. Lastly,
definitely.
Walden. Yes,
Because my sense is that it is going to be with the collapse of the multilateral system. The BRICS is going to be not the only game in town, but probably the biggest game in town from the point of view of the global south. And we might as well participate in that game of
might as
shaping it.
well. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, it's funny because you talk to a lot of Filipinos, they don't feel as part of the global South, which is really a weird thing, right? Um, we really are a
Uh,
conflicted nation in terms of identity, Walden. Isn't it weird, right? You don't see that in Latin America. I think a lot of Latin Americans, even if they literally look white, right, because of their Spanish or Portuguese heritage, they very much feel part of the global South, unless they're Argentinians, right? Unless they're Argentinians. But I don't want to go down that road. Um, but in the Philippines, parang anong
yeah,
global
no,
South? No, we are Team West, right? We are like rules-based international order, and
well, you know, I think what's happening in the United States is going to make us realize we're part of the global south. That you now have an anti-immigrant president.
yeah, just slapping around everyone. Like,
Yeah, and it's most likely that he's going to make a deal with China over the area, and basically I think what's happening is that you have trends that are pushing us to
mhm.
realize that we really are part of the global south. And it might take some time, but I think that would be that this notion of we being honorary Westerners, I think that's going to dissipate fairly fast in the next decade or so.
Well, given how shabbily Trump is treating Ukraine, who at some point was feeling very much part of the Western club, um, natatawa ko sa honorary kasi I remember when you were calling Egyptians as honorary Asians, and then I was calculating, well, the Sinai Desert is pretty big. You know? It's like, in fairness, they have some good claim to be Asians too, right? Like you're mean, Walden. There's a mean streak in you people don't see, but I always notice. It's like, iba talagang Ilocano, very biting pag naging sarcastic. Yeah, honorary Asians, these Egyptians. Um,
Did I really say that?
Yes, because I never forgot that. Like until last night, literally, when I was looking at the Gaza plan post construction, and I thought about, what? Like Sinai Desert is so big, and I was looking at the Shuttle Arab. I was looking at the posh resorts that they have on the Asian side. You were mean to the Egyptians. I mean, it's like, and I saved your life
No.
in Egypt, so that will be forever memorable. Last point, Walden. Parting points. Are you excited about this total war conflagration between Duterte and Marcos? Do you think there's a historic opportunity for the progressives to finally make a headway? Because that's what we didn't discuss as much, right? We discussed about the failures of the left, about the shortcomings of the left. How do you think the left can build an autonomous? I think that's a term one of your other favorite students used, that we need to be a third force autonomy. How should we do that, Walden? What does your wisdom say from past failures? Because I think we have to be honest, the left has had many setbacks, unfortunately. But there is opportunity. There is now opening. Riza is doing fantastic. Akbayan has a good chance. Ronald Llamas is already a celebrity. We have made Gramsci almost a household name. No, I'm just kidding. So what? Then tell me, moving forward, how can the progressives, whether left liberal, progressive, so maybe it can go from Adam Tooze to Walden Bellio to Richard Hayden. Let's make it as wide spectrum as possible. How can it become an autonomous force and take advantage of this other Cold War, right? Duterte versus Marcos.
Well, the first thing is, well, let's just end with this. I really, it would be suicidal for progressives to take sides in this conflict between the two. Um, I think because it's a no-win situation for the left if Duterte wins or the Marcoses win. Okay, it what it's not always correct as a strategy to side with the lesser evil. Okay. I think, and in these two circumstances where it's even hard to say which is the lesser evil, I think it would probably be not a very good idea to take sides in this. And I think that's the first thing. The second thing is progressives, wide spectrum of progressives should really rethink about um, moving away from the sectarianism that has divided them into beginning to talk to each other in serious ways and in mature ways that basically finding common ground. And again, I go back to Nemenso, to Dr. Nemenso, and I even compared him to Chon Lai. That both of them had this common push for uh, for finding common grounds among different forces. Okay, so I think that's really the key. And then the third thing is, I really think that we really need um, uh, to create this atmosphere that you're creating, helping to create at this point, of really thinking, rethinking the political economy of the country, to see where we have gone wrong in terms of policies. And because unless this is both a political and an intellectual effort, we're not going to go anywhere. Okay, so I would say that the easiest thing there is not taking sides. The next is the next harder thing is unification, however broad it is. And then the third part is really getting rid of the sort of neoliberal thinking that has brought our country to this impasse at this point in time. So, and we have to do all of those things together. So that's my 10 cents worth or 10 centavos worth. And
And yeah, yeah. What was the money in dirham, dinar in Egypt where we almost died? Like I was like, what was the money there? Dirham,
but,
whatever. Pound, Egyptian pound. Social sila, di ba?
right, the Egyptian pound. Okay.
Well, again,
And
Walden, sorry for taking away from a special day, Valentine's Day. I know that was a special
no.
day. I
I
always love
appreciate
these conversations.
anytime you ask me, Richard, I owe you my life because you saved me from a beating in Egypt. I don't know whether people want to go into the details of how I saved from a beating by you and our friend Sabrina Gakad, but nevertheless,
Don't exaggerate her role. She was just gonna be a witness and write our last moment story. But sige
all
sige
right.
na, sige na nga. But thank you so much for that, Walden. I mean, for me, I'm absolutely with you. I mean, let's go Trotsky, neither nor, right? But I think again, where we differ perhaps is for me, I think we can take down your enemies one by one. So I believe in a sequencing strategy. But then again, that's a long conversation. On China, my sense always was you're absolutely right. On a global level, we're not seeing China as a kind of a imperialistic power in the sense that the West has been for 1,000 years or 500 years or 200 years. But I think regionally speaking, I'm deeply worried about China's hegemonic ambitions. And to end with the perfect guy, Zhou and Lai, it's too early to say. All I'm gonna say about where China. I'm gonna say the same thing he said to Kissinger. It's too early to say, right? So if he
That's
couldn't
right.
decide about the fate of the French Revolution 200 years later,
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, I'm not sure we can also tell about where China will go in the next 10, 20, 30 years, or who knows, much earlier. But nevertheless, you're right, Walden. We have to be as evidence-based and non-hater,
Mm.
non-prejudicial as possible. And I think, unfortunately, in the Philippines, we have been overfed, especially in your school, at least kami sa UP, I think we had good dose of anti-Americanism. But practically outside UP, like the level of naivety about American colonialism, I mean, for heaven's sake, they don't even recognize us as a ex-colony. I was like, what Commonwealth are you talking about? You stole our revolution, right? You're the gringos who stole our revolution. So thank you, Walden, for being that lightning rod for balancing against Ronald Llamas, who really flexed his credentials and basically telling you two idiots, you write good books, but you have no direct interaction with gangsters. And I was so glad he left towards the end and gave us 15 minutes. So kumbaga, Walden, this whole conversation was what we wanted to do if not for Ronald taking us in very interesting direction. But mabuhay ka, mabuhay si Ronald, and God willing, inshallah, I'm gonna be very religious. Sorry, Walden, I'm always a man of piety. Hopefully,
Thank you.
for our volume 3, don't forget that. Marami
Sure.
pang inggit, marami pang gustong sumali. Van Jackson, Max Saxer, I mean, all sorts of progressive thinkers. So we're doing something right, maybe.
Sure. And it would be great to have Ronald back. I
Oh yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think Ronald, yeah, he owes us some apology. No, just kidding. No, he's great. He's the selling point. Talk to you soon,
yeah,
Walden. Salamat,
yeah.
Sensei, and God bless.
Okay. Thanks.
Blessed Valentine.
Richard.